This is Marcus Whitney's audio universe.
Like, you gotta do the work. You gotta show up and just do the work.
What's good? Happy Friday. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Final episode of Marcus Whitney Live for the week. I'm really excited. This is a conversation that's been a long time in the making. We've been trying to get the calendars worked out, but this woman is busy, y'all. She is on fire as of the last, couple of months. There's been some fantastic traction going her way, and I was introduced to her by the very first guest on this show, my man Q Terry. So thank you, Q, for the connection. I'm excited. This topic is something I am personally passionate about as somebody who's made their career in technology over the last 20 years. And has always sort of looked for more data, more information, more transparency around really the importance of the technology industry and how it impacts our country, how it impacts populations, and how it can be, something that better reflects this country. And so we're really, really grateful to have Sherrell Dorsey, who is the founder of The Plug and longtime sort of technologist and journalist covering this space. Sherrell, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Marcus. Really excited to be on with you.
Yeah, great to have you. So we always sort of start with a bit of a sort of origin story, just to sort of understand how somebody actually got into the space they are. So if you don't mind.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like I started kind of early, maybe compared to most, and maybe late compared to most as well. I'm from Seattle originally, so grew up in the land of Microsoft and Amazon. Got an opportunity to be part of a program with the Technology Access Foundation, which in '96 essentially took a storefront in the inner city, transformed it into a computer learning center, and taught kids of color how to code, how to set up servers, all kinds of different programming languages, trained us in, everything from how to interview to how to select a college major. So very grateful for that kind of start. And from that, got an opportunity to work at Microsoft every summer in high school as an intern. So went away to college with kind of a standard around what my experience was supposed to look like. And then also my deep connection to technology, and technology specifically at the hands of folks of color, leading the way. So that really shaped my entire life experience and the experience that I draw on from today. Went to school in New York City, went undergrad, FIT, grad school at Columbia. And, just the last few years have been really navigating a space around startups and tech and sort of this idea that genius only looks like one thing. And so in my work and in my writing, which I started off more freelance while I was working at places like Uber and on contract at Google Fiber, my writing and journalism has always sort of centered the voices, faces, places, communities of people of color, and specifically some of the questions that we don't ask in mainstream media about who gets to be called genius and who gets to be called innovator. And so that really defines what I do today, which is I am the founder and CEO of The Plug, and we're a digital insights platform covering the Black innovation economy. Just rigorous data-driven reporting that helps us to better understand the world around us and sort of the Black contribution to a society that's moving forward in an age of technology.
So thank you so much. That was an incredible background. And I needed to just, point out that you have a grad degree from an Ivy League school. You've been in some of the biggest brands in technology, companies like Uber, Google Fiber. So you've been in these spaces, right? These spaces where the geniuses live, right? Where the geniuses are born, are created, are held up. And so I found it interesting that you sort of focused on who gets to be called a genius, who gets to be called an innovator. That's something that not the genius moniker, but certainly the innovator moniker is something I've always prided myself on and always wanted to, base my career on. When people say, who are you? I'll say I'm an entrepreneur or creative, but really innovator is what I care most about. Can you talk about what made that, at what point in that journey did it really sort of stand out to you? You're growing up in Seattle, you're having access to these programs and learning how to code and things like that, at what point did it really dawn on you, oh, wow, like I'm in all these spaces consistently, and it is really clear that people that look like me are not in the conversation or included in a significant way?
That's such a great question. I have cousins, especially if you're coming from a city like Seattle that has such a low representation of a Black population. And like, believe me, my family was very Black, originally from Detroit. So, they were very intentional about creating a community and an environment where we knew who it is that we were. But the thing was like, you did Jack and Jill, you were part of all the Black cultural things within the city. And then you went to an HBCU. So that HBCU tour was pretty drastic. Only reason why I deviated and didn't go to Spelman was because I really wanted to be in New York. Otherwise, that's where I would have been.
Okay.
But my cousins that went away, to school, they would come home, they would talk about their classes. They would talk about the things that they were creating. And I mean, they were, early engineers and managers at places like GM. They were coming from Clark Atlanta, from Spelman, and from Morehouse. And I just remember the sense of pride, in the sense of like, creating and developing and building was just kind of a natural subset of their experience.
Mm-hmm.
And they would come home and they were subscribed. They got subscriptions for me to Black Enterprise magazine. There was a lot of like investment on their end. And I don't even think they realized it at such a young age, of them saying like, there's another alternative than just sort of going the traditional linear path towards getting a job and sort of just living this life that, is very much a tried and true, and more so like going after what other people have always had access to. And so, I think for me, knowing that, seeing that, being raised in it, and then going into an environment in Microsoft where I had mentors that were Black, who were lead engineers, at the time. So for me, it was never something that was abnormal.
Right.
Because I had always been trained by these individuals. And so it was such a stark contrast to kind of get into the working world and to see that lack of representation. And then within media, to not see ample representation of Black and brown genius, when I'm like, I grew up with these folks, literally was raised by Black innovators. And I won't even just say the folks who had the technical skills and background. It's like I always talk about working at Auntie Monica's hair salon. Like that's where I learned customer service.
Yeah.
That's where I learned, what it means to manage clientele and inventory, and market services and products. So, for me, it was just like, how is the rest of the world not seeing this? But then when you started to look at the literature, it was not indicative of other people's voices or communities being the heroes of their own stories or the innovators that have built dynamic things. I mean, we're just in the last couple of years finding out about Black inventors, even Jack Daniels and, Uncle Ernest.
Uncle Nearest, yeah.
Uncle Nearest, excuse me, yes. And so like all of these stories and these lines that like journalists either missed or intentionally weren't looking for, that was problematic for me because especially working in tech, you constantly have to know what's going on. You have to know what's going on with your competitor. You have to know which companies are doing what, who's raced what. And so as I'm reading on a daily basis, all of the top publications, it was like, well, where's, all of these other folks that I've met at conferences that are building significant work as well. That was missing from the narrative. And then when you saw the narrative, it was like the folks who they clearly, that media had clearly kind of deemed as like the magical, mystical Black person, that was somewhat featured everywhere.
Yeah.
And it was like, there are so like alone North Carolina A&T graduates some of the top, numbers in terms of Black engineers. And you couldn't find one other person to interview for a story.
Right.
So I think it was the frustration of the laziness. And like I said, I had started just writing on the side for folks like Fast Company, Black Enterprise.
Okay.
I wanted to see rigorous stories and pieces. I literally had flown to like South by Southwest. This was probably like circa, 2014, 2015. And I like flew on my own dime. I pitched the route and was like, there are literally no Black publications at South by Southwest, one of the most meaningful conferences in the world for technology. And we're not here. We're talking about consumer technology. We're talking about what we're playing with and purchasing, but we're not talking about what we're creating. And I think this is a miss. And so that's kind of how I just started like wedging my way into publications and whomever would accept me. And so, through the years, I just wanted to get smarter around how I report, how do I document trends? And editors were very gracious with me because, I didn't have a journalism background at the time. So they kind of had to show me and demonstrate to me like how to report a story.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually it was like, working for top tech companies, like data is essential to everything and every decision that's made. And so that sharpened me into understanding like there's a storytelling component to this. How do I sharpen this and develop databases and data sets that specifically talk about the trends that are shaping the Black innovation economy and how that fits into where we're moving forward as a society? Because I was tired of the poverty stories, tired of the disparity stories. Right. Like that to me was just like, we can't talk about anything else. We can't, we've not done anything else. And for me, it was just like, what, I'm going to keep writing and covering it. And at some point, it was like, I was tired of pitching editors who either didn't get it or wouldn't let me have my own vertical or column. I was like, at this point, like, y'all should just give me my own column. And then like, as I was having conversations with people, they were just like, you always know who's doing what and where, like you're totally the plug. And I was like, maybe I'll just do my own daily newsletter and then I don't have to harass the rest of y'all. So that's kind of how it was born. Like, 2016, I'm waking up at like 4 or 5 in the morning and just like, curating news, talking about who I'm meeting and just like trying to see, Monday through Friday, like, is there enough to be said about what's going on in order for this to like be a potential thing? And it was definitely a labor of love. And after about a year or so in, I got like an email from Capital One and they're like, we want to sponsor this. This is pretty incredible. And I was like, oh, I can make some money from this. And so it was very accidental in that light. But, coming just out of the frustration of like, if we're not ensuring that our stories are being told in a way that is dignifying and intelligent, and I'm not saying they have to be like great fluff aspirational stories, but like any kind of representation that digs into our businesses and not just that we're Black in public. I think that it was worth the labor, and also asking the journalism industry to be much more open, because as much as it has critiqued the tech industry, it's like y'all have done the same thing throughout time.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like this is the point in the conversation where I'll thank you so that I can move on, but just say as a Black innovator and a Black entrepreneur, one of the big challenges is that the media really understands me from one perspective, right? And I think it's the narrative that you've been saying, right? Is this single person where, there's no other people out there who are innovators. I mean, it's like, for me, the origin story for me is my uncle, who was an engineer at IBM. That's how I got started. And that's what I wrote in my book. I talked about how he gave me an IBM PC Junior when I was, 8 or 9 years old. And that's the beginning, you know what I mean? And it's like, there are so many stories out there, and constantly being sort of framed in one narrative is just not, it's not real. It's not helpful, especially when it is absent of the data. Right, especially when it's absent of the data, and so I want to thank you for doing the labor of love long enough for someone to start paying you for it.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing
Feels
that.
Good.
So let's jump into venture capital quickly. I don't want to stay here too long, but this is an area where I think the data is very damning. It's a very, very serious indictment where we may have plenty of capable Black innovators, Black engineers, but they certainly are not participating in the venture capital economy. How have you gone about looking at that from a data and an insights perspective? It's the obvious story, but it also isn't that well documented, quite frankly. So I'm interested in what has been your approach, from the plug perspective.
Yeah, I think it's such a broad like space, right? I think there's so many angles, and I think that there's been a lot of interesting studies and discoveries that we've had through the years. And so where I try in all of our stories is to find like what's not being asked, because we can kind of keep talking about, like less than, 0.006% of Black women.
We've heard this a million times.
Like, Yeah, like all these stats that, are kind of hit or miss. You got to really be careful with numbers because sometimes we overly use them in spaces where they're not necessarily appropriate. But I think that for us, it really has been around this new push towards funding Black founders and Latinx founders and sort of all of these major initiatives. It was very similar to the Black hair care industry, where we'd kind of privately always been creating products and services for ourselves because we weren't being served by mass market. And then as soon as like there was a study around or some research around our spending and our buying power, particularly in the area of beauty, is when you saw traditional brands that ignored us on the shelves and relegated us to like the two products, like on the side of the corner that were pretty questionable outside of the relaxers, then all of a sudden everyone started to like be about Black women's empowerment with our hair. And I think that's kind of the same to be true here with the VC space. And I think that where there's kind of these national imperatives around elevating Black and brown people, they're quickly being co-opted around we funded a Black woman founder. Like all the emails that I get around like, oh, and we've done this, we've done that, and people like want a trophy or a cookie for doing the things that should already be inherent and innate. But again, these systems are not designed to let others in. We've seen that throughout time, particularly in the founding of this country. It's designed to not allow for economic mobility for everyone, but a select few. So when we do our research and our work, we're asking very simple questions. If you are telling me that you are supporting and recruiting and funding Black and brown people in these spaces, I want to understand who, when, where, why, how. And I also want to understand how does that compare to who you've already been funding? Because if you have billions of dollars under assets and you say, here's $2 million, what you're still essentially saying is you aren't good enough. We're not willing to do the work to find and recruit the right people in the right companies. We're not willing to go the distance for these founders. Now, there are some exceptions to the rules. There are some pretty well-funded Black startups as well, but that's very far and few between when we compare the stats against white and Asian male-led startups. That's just the reality. I do not believe that we aren't creating the kinds of products and services that could be funded. I think that we're not all hanging around in Silicon Valley. I believe some of us are in St. Louis. I believe some of us are definitely in Atlanta. And so I think that, like the journalism industry of not really recognizing Black innovation, it just comes down to laziness and, what racism really is, which is the most insidious disease that our country has. So we try to ask a different question. We try to ask, is this real? When you make bold statements, when there's a lot of PR and publicity, but very little meat. And what's funny too, Marcus, is that it doesn't take a ton of effort to see when people are lying to you, right? And I liken it, and I tell my team this, I'm like, the reality is like a lot of people are playing in our faces, and we need to make sure that we are diligent and dogged about holding them to account. So yeah, that's really how we approach and try to ask these questions about funding, that who, what, when, where, and why.
Covering this space in this moment, can you just quickly talk about some of the recent grants that you've been awarded? I know it was public information, so I hope I'm not like.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, so what's interesting is that like the timing was just so interesting because it looked like, oh, like Sherrell, because of X, Y, and Z, she's gotten this, this, and this. And the reality is like, we're applying for grants all the time. Right. So some of them, I've certainly been rejected for more than I've actually received. But obviously like this year, there were some really major ones. So I'm, one of the first fellows for Northwestern University, Medill's School of Journalism. and the Garage, which is their co-working innovation center. I'm the first fellow as part of this program and initiative that they are pushing towards supporting Black folks in media. So that's like an $80,000 fellowship plus access to, I can take classes across the university, and then I'll also be hosting office hours for students. So super excited about that opportunity, which is pretty major. And then, we got some funding from the Knight Foundation to build out a dashboard focused on racial equity and inclusion based off some reporting that we did on tech company CEOs making statements denouncing racial injustice and police brutality following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis this past May. And that kind of really, I think, catapulted us in our work into the stratosphere in a way that in which that has brought some really interesting attention. Not just, I think, the story that we told and in the way in which we did our work, because it's not the first time that we've pushed out infographics or our spreadsheets, right? But it was definitely a timely matter that also helped to bring out radical transparency around the difference between what tech companies are saying versus what they're doing internally, and representation across the board of who they're hiring, how they're hiring, what kind of dollars are they committing long-term to social justice movements or what have you. And we got some resources from a LinFest Night initiative in Philadelphia to launch a Philly kind of newsletter project over the next year. So it has been a busy time, but I will tell you this, Marcus, being able to have resources to do the work that you're passionate about makes a big difference, especially during a time in COVID where the journalism industry has lost over 40,000 jobs across the board, folks, just tons and tons of layoffs. So it feels really good to be able to keep money in people's pockets. About 98% of my team are Black folks or folks of color. And it feels really good, to be able to have the resources to have my team members paid. And, the vendors, I try to make sure that I find and source some of the best, services by Black and brown folks as possible, so that I can continue to keep their businesses floating as well with these resources that I've been graciously given. So, yeah, I think those are all the grants most recently. So in total, it's a little over $400,000 collectively. I've earned about $500K in just grants. So some equity-free funding. That has obviously been tremendous. And I'm not sure how much you know about like media industry, but it's really hard from a VC standpoint.
I know enough. I know enough.
Yeah. So whereas, I think that I kind of stayed away from VC dollars just because I was trying to make sure I figured out our business model, which is subscription-based, advertising, content licensing, what have you. I stayed away from VC dollars, number one, because I knew I needed to figure out how am I building a strong journalism platform without the influence of just like build fast and break things.
Yep.
And now it's like, at least with the grants, they help to supplement and get us to the next step. While we're still kind of figuring out like how do we grow. And that's kind of where the busyness comes from, is like I've been a one-woman shop for a while, and I had some resources to bring on, a managing editor, in the past, and being able to do little things here and there. And now it's like I have so many things I want to grow and build out, and tools that I want to use, and reporting that I just want to fund. That is like, if I could show you what I'm sitting on right now, like it would be absurd. But I'm like, I need to build more capacity. And so that's kind of the conundrum, right, of entrepreneurship, of figuring out like, how do you move the money around? How do you kind of do the most with the least? And then also like, how do you grow in a way that is sustainable for you? Because I never wanted to be an entrepreneur that didn't have a life or didn't have time for my nieces and my nephews and my family. And, so also figuring out the best route towards a kind of a prosperous business that also grants me the freedom to do the work that I love without it eating me alive.
So I'm hoping we can wrap this conversation up on a hopeful note. And everything that you've been talking about is really hopeful, especially like, all the resources that have been coming in. I am really, really interested to hear about the demand side the genuine demand for this information that you're curating and figuring out the right way to present, and the stories that you're telling. Talk about the demand that's out there in the market and what is behind this demand. At the end of the day, I have to think that the reason for you doing this is to help build a case for people in power to make substantial moves to balance the scales, right? At the end of the day, what are you seeing beyond the grants from these institutions, which is really great, but the actual demand to consume this information, to subscribe, what can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, it's interesting because you really hit the nail on the head. I think when I started this off, I was like, what would the world look like if it had rigorous and dogged information insight on what's happening in the Black tech ecosystem?
Yes.
I think that there was kind of a general knowledge, a very cursory knowledge. I think, Black folks in our own subcultures and subcommunities kind of know what the deal is, but bringing it out to the mainstream and putting a data and a science and an art to it is kind of it's a very different task, because you have to be sound enough that the researchers respect you. And then you also have to be rigorous enough that the journalists believe that you belong there. Mm-hmm. And I think, just kind of that consciousness around, some people believing, especially in my early days, and also like trying to raise money, folks were just like, this is too niche, or, could another organization already do this? I'm like, but they're not. Right. Or we've already funded Blavity, so we don't need another Black-owned millennial site. And I'm like, that's not what this is. Like, yeah. Right. The idiocy, like again, going back to this idea around racism, like it's stupid. And so you're just like, well, no, because you actually don't have enough information to make educated choices and decisions around what's going on in like Black tech ecosystems. And so how that trickles out is, if you're not hearing about this in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal in a meaningful way that resonates with the way in which you speak and you learn about companies, when those Black and brown people get to the board table, you think automatically that like all they're doing is creating for Black and brown people. You have all of these negative assumptions because your literature, because you weren't forced to read the literature in school. We weren't even, right? But like, you don't have the right literature. And so either you treat us and send us to the Black Fund as a kind of a charity case, right? Or you do not have enough context to understand the weight in the weight of the identity. And that trickles down in like US bankers. And this is like an actual stat from like, I think Deloitte, where they were like, they thought that, Black owned businesses were well funded. They thought that, there wasn't an issue with getting loans. Right. And that's why like the data and the insight is very important, and the conversations have to be had in public across the board. So one thing I'm grateful for is to see like a lot of these tech reporters who are following me and editors who are following me who have, obviously been reaching out and like building studies and cases. Like there's much more prowess around getting to stories that matter. You see Wall Street Journal launching like a diversity newsletter. You see all of these other mainstream publications who are like, oh, I get it. And like, honestly, that's been my America. That's kind of what I've wanted to see is like our activities are so significant. You need to talk about them in tandem with all of the news that you are reporting on a daily basis. Absolutely. It has to be a priority. And not just, of course, for Black folks, right? Like it's for everyone across the board.
It's for everybody.
And it can't be patronizing. It can't be like the magical, mythical Black person, female, transgender, differently abled person. It has to be across the board. Yeah. And that is kind of the imperative that I'm working toward.
Amazing. This show goes quick. Thank you so much. This was really, really insightful for me. These are things that I think about and I wonder about a lot. And I'm just on the side of the entrepreneur and to a degree the investor. And I've got massive blind spots around this data as well. So what you're doing is super important. I will out myself. I think I'm still on the free subscription. I'm gonna pay for a subscription.
Time to come on over.
After this show, I'm paying for the for the actual subscription. I'm paying. And just thank you for putting in the legwork for years so that when the moment was right, you were ready, and the resources are with you now. And I just wish you absolute success and more support in the days to come.
Thank you so much for having me. This was very meaningful. Looking forward to reading your book and reading more about your story as well, Marcus. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody out there. You got to follow Sherrell. You can find her. She's super funny on Twitter. So you should definitely subscribe on Twitter. But tpinsights.com. That's the website. Go check them out. Go subscribe to the newsletter today. It is great. It's been a great read to add to everything else that I'm picking up on. And you'll immediately become smarter about the Black tech economy. As she mentioned, my book, Create and Orchestrate, in stores right now. I wrote this for many, many reasons, but one of them is because, quite frankly, so many of the business books, sort of are only written by white men. And I love those business books. I have no problem with them. But, we should have business books written by everybody, and we should have everybody contributing to this form of literature that shapes the way that we think about business. And so I hope if you haven't already gotten it, you'll consider getting Create and Orchestrate, the podcast, Marcus Whitney's Audio Universe, everywhere that you get podcasts, and follow me online at Marcus Whitney everywhere on social. And that's it. I hope you all have a wonderful, blessed weekend. Stay safe, take care of each other, and let's build a new normal, y'all. Peace.
Thank you for tuning in to Marcus Whitney's Audio Universe.